The sun had burned the land bare long before she came. By late summer, the sky itself seemed fevered, low, red, and endless. Every breath of wind dragged the taste of salt and sand across the prairie, until even the bones of the earth split open in thirst. Amara Johnson walked through that ruin, her shadow trembling on the cracked ground. She was 19, no older than the drought itself, and the world had turned against her with a slow, merciless patience. Her shoes, thin canvas and torn at the heel, filled with dust until her steps sounded like dry paper folding. The hem of her dress, once the soft blue of her mother's apron, now hung in tatters, stiff with sweat and dirt. For days she had followed nothing but the promise of distance. Pools that shimmered in the heat would vanish as she neared. The air itself bent and lied. When she looked toward the horizon, it shivered like a glass of water just out of reach. Her lips had cracked until they bled. She counted her breaths, slow, measured, deliberate, as if rationing them might keep her alive. Somewhere beyond that wide silence, she told herself, there must still be people. A fence post, a roof, a sound that wasn't wind. Then she saw it, a smear of movement on the far edge of sight, something rising, gold and thick. Dust, the kind that comes before a storm. The ground began to tremble. Wind gathered and turned cruel, scraping her skin raw. It caught her scarf and tore it loose, sent it whipping across her face before vanishing into the glare. She tried to cover her mouth with her hands, but the air filled with grit so fine it burned her eyes to tears. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. She dropped to her knees, half crawling, half dragging herself toward a faint shape on the horizon. Maybe a barn, maybe her imagination. Her mind throbbed with one thought, over and over. Not like this, not out here. And then the light dimmed. The world turned brown, then black, and she knew she would not stand again. But out of that roaring darkness, a voice cut through, rough, human, real. "Damn it! Someone's out there!" A hand seized her arm. She tried to fight, but her limbs no longer obeyed. The voice shouted something else, words she couldn't make out. And then she was lifted, carried against a chest that smelled of sweat, leather, and whiskey. The storm's cry dulled into muffled thunder as a door slammed shut behind them. When her eyes opened again, she saw dim light, smoke, and the shapes of men. 6, maybe 7 of them, scattered around a bunkhouse heavy with heat and tobacco. The air was thick enough to chew. Their laughter stopped the moment she was dropped inside. Every gaze turned. Men with beards gone wild from neglect. Eyes sharp from hunger, not of food. One leaned forward, teeth flashing. "Well, look what the wind brought in." Another, younger, laughed. "A storm gift." Amara pressed herself against the wall. Her arms crossed her chest by instinct. Her heartbeat filled her ears. The youngest reached out, his fingers brushing the torn hem of her dress, until a deeper voice stopped him cold. "That's enough." The air changed. In the doorway stood a man, tall, shoulders broad enough to steady the room. His coat still carried the storm, but his eyes were clear, gray as rain clouds that hadn't forgotten how to break. Elias Garrison, the foreman. Without raising his tone, he stepped between her and the others. "This girl needs water," he said. "Anyone who thinks otherwise can pack his gear by dawn." No one answered. The young man backed away, muttering. Elias's hand came to rest briefly on Amara's arm. Not rough, not claiming, only steady. "Come," he said quietly. Through the blur of grit and tears, she looked up at him. There was no pity in his face, no judgment either. Only something unspoken, a kind of vow. She let him lead her from the smoke and sweat into the thin light beyond the door. Behind them, the storm kept howling. But for the first time in days, Amara felt something shift inside her. A pulse of safety, a fragile thread of life that refused to die in the dust. The storm had softened by the time Elias led her across the yard. The world beyond the bunkhouse lay drowned in dust and twilight. Wind still combed through the fences, low and restless, while the horses turned their heads from the grit. Somewhere far off, thunder stumbled over the hills and fell silent. Elias said nothing. He moved with that deliberate calm of a man who had lived too long among storms, weather or human. His hand hovered near her back, never quite touching, yet steadying her all the same. At the edge of the yard stood a timber house, square and plain, with a lamp glowing in its window like a small, stubborn heartbeat. Elias opened the door and motioned her in. Warmth met her first. The hush of firewood burning slow, the faint smell of pine and stew. For a moment, Amara forgot her own body. Her shoulders sagged, her knees almost gave. The world that had been all wind and ache became still enough to breathe again. A man stood by the hearth, laying another log into the flames. The light revealed the gray in his hair, the heaviness of his posture. When he turned, his eyes, dark, brown, searching, found her at once. Samuel Henderson, owner of the ranch, widower 5 years. His face carried the marks of seasons that had asked too much. Lines cut deep around the mouth, shadows under the eyes. A man built for work and loss in equal measure. "Who is she?" His voice was quiet but firm, like gravel under slow boots. Elias brushed the dust from his hat. "Someone the wind tried to kill, found her out by the ridge." Samuel studied her in silence. His gaze was not cruel, only measured, the kind that weighed truth before sympathy. Amara tried to speak her name, but her throat rasped like paper. Samuel turned, filled a tin cup from a jug, and held it out. When her trembling hands failed to grasp it, his larger one steadied hers. "Drink," he said. The first swallow burned, then soothed. Water slid down her throat like mercy. She didn't realize she was crying until her tears fell into the cup. He said nothing, only took the empty tin, refilled it, and turned back to the hearth. From the cupboard he gathered what little he had: carrots, dried meat, a handful of beans, and set them in a pot. The rhythm of the knife against the board filled the room, soft and certain. Soon the smell of stew rose with the fire's breath, spreading warmth into every shadow. Amara sat near the table, watching. Each small motion, the stirring, the tasting, the silent care, felt foreign to her. No man had ever cooked for her before. When he set a bowl in front of her, she hesitated, unsure whether to thank him or apologize for existing. Samuel gave no sign he expected either. He simply nodded once as if to say, "Eat." The first spoonful brought her back to life. Salt, smoke, and warmth wove together on her tongue. She ate slowly, afraid it might disappear if she hurried. Across the table, Samuel folded his arms. He did not touch his own bowl. His eyes remained on her, not watchful, but witnessing. Beneath the calm of his face, there was something like wonder. Perhaps he was remembering the sound of another breath in this house after years of silence. When she finished, he stood and reached for a wool blanket from the back of a chair. Without a word, he laid it over her shoulders. His touch lingered only for a heartbeat, enough for her to feel the warmth behind the roughness. "Rest," he said, tone clipped but gentle. "We'll talk come morning." Amara clutched the blanket close, feeling its weight settle around her like belonging. The fire's glow blurred her vision, but she stayed awake long enough to see Samuel turn away, his shoulders outlined by light, his face unreadable yet softened by thought. Outside, the storm moved on, dragging its tail of dust into the dark. Inside, the small room breathed again. For the first time in many days, Amara did not feel like a ghost wandering the drought. She was flesh. She was seen. And somewhere in that tired man's eyes, she thought she caught the faintest reflection of her own salvation. Morning crept into the house the way mercy sometimes does, softly, almost unsure it was welcome. Light filtered through the cracks of the wooden shutters, laying thin gold stripes across the kitchen floor, across the cold pot still sitting near the fire. The storm had passed, leaving behind silence and the faint scent of wet earth. Amara stirred awake on the bench by the hearth. The blanket Samuel had given her still clung to her shoulders, faintly smelling of pine and smoke. For a long moment, she stayed still, listening to the slow creak of timbers, to the breathing of a house that had known too much quiet. Then she rose. Her body ached, but her mind was clear. She had been taken in, fed, given shelter. That meant she owed something back. Gratitude, to her, was not spoken. It was worked for. The kitchen was a mess of yesterday's fatigue, plates unwashed, crumbs left behind, pots dulled with grease. She tied the blanket around her waist and began to move. Ashes were swept. Dishes were scrubbed. The fire was coaxed alive again, obedient to her hands. She found what little there was in the pantry: cornmeal, salted meat, 2 potatoes. It would be enough. She sliced and stirred, her thin shoulders swaying slightly with the rhythm of the knife. The sound of sizzling fat filled the room, joined by the soft rattle of utensils, the distant whinny of horses, and the rooster's rough call from the yard. The world outside was already returning to its work, and so was she. When Samuel stepped into the doorway, he stopped short. There, in the soft glow of morning, stood the young woman he had pulled from the storm, hair brushed smooth, sleeves rolled, her dark hands steady over the stove. For the first time in years, the house smelled of breakfast. Amara turned quickly when she heard him. I only thought to repay your kindness," she said, voice low, unsure. Samuel didn't answer. He only nodded once, moving to the table with his usual silence. But his eyes followed her, each motion, each careful gesture, as if trying to understand how someone so small could bring the weight of calm into a house built from loneliness. Outside, voices began to rise, men calling to one another, boots striking dirt. Before long, the bunkhouse door creaked and the first of the ranch hands filed in. Their laughter came rough and familiar, but it faltered the moment they saw her. A woman at the table, a stranger, brown-skinned and unafraid to meet their eyes. "Lord," one muttered, rubbing his neck. "Thought I was still drunk." The others laughed, too loud, the sound thick with something unkind. Amara kept her gaze down, ladling the stew into bowls, pretending not to hear. But her hand trembled once, a small betrayal that did not go unnoticed. Billy, the youngest, bold from ignorance, grinned. "Didn't think the boss so generous," he said, "bringing in a maid, and a pretty one at that." The laughter rose again, coarse and stale. Then came the scrape of a chair. Samuel stood. He said nothing at first. His gaze swept the table, cool as a shadow. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, iron-wrapped in calm. "One more word, Billy, and you'll be packing your gear by sundown." The air broke. No one moved. Billy's smirk collapsed into a stiff swallow, and he dropped his eyes to his bowl. Samuel sat again as though nothing had happened. Only the fire popped, and Amara's breathing eased. She placed a bowl before him, careful not to meet his eyes. But when she did glance up, just once, what she saw wasn't pity. It was steadiness, a silent promise. For a moment, she wanted to thank him, but words felt too small for what had just been given, a space to stand without fear. The men began to eat, the sound of spoons and low murmurs filling the kitchen again. Slowly, the rhythm of the house settled back into itself, though something unseen had changed within it. Amara sat near the hearth once more, her hands folded in her lap. The warmth of the fire brushed her face, and beyond it, she caught the faintest reflection of Samuel, head bowed, eating in silence as though trying to remember how to share a table with someone else. Outside, the plains stretched wide and windless, dust still clinging to the horizon. But inside this small ranch house, amid the quiet and the clatter, something fragile had begun to take shape. Not yet a home, not yet a love, but the first faint outline of both. By afternoon, the sun slanted low through the kitchen window, its light soft as dust on glass. Amara had spent the day quietly, hauling water, sweeping floors, mending a torn shirt she found by the door. The stillness of the house suited her. Silence was safer than words. It gave her hands room to work, and her thoughts somewhere to rest. When she finished, she carried the folded shirt down the narrow hall. That was when she saw it, an open door at the far end, light flickering faintly inside. She hesitated, unsure if she should pass. But curiosity, gentle and uninvited, guided her forward. The room was small. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Near the window sat a man, Samuel, his back bent slightly, his large hands resting on an old wooden chest. The lid stood open, revealing a few women's dresses folded thin with age, a wide-brimmed hat, a worn Bible, and a single photograph in a cracked frame. He hadn't heard her. He was tracing the edge of the picture with his thumb, as though the motion could hold time still. In the faded image, a blonde-haired woman smiled faintly beside a little girl no older than 6. Their faces were caught forever in summer light, while his, older now, heavier, carried the ache of someone who had lived too long with ghosts. Amara took a step closer. The floor creaked softly, and Samuel turned at once, startled. For a moment, he looked like a man found in grief he'd meant to hide. "You shouldn't be in here," he said. The words were flat, not harsh, but they carried the edge of someone who had forgotten how to be seen. Amara lowered her head. "I'm sorry." The door was open. He exhaled, rubbing his brow. "It's all right." His voice cracked on the last word, so faintly she almost missed it. He sank back into the chair, gaze fixed on the chest. "This room belonged to my wife and my daughter." The way he said daughter was almost a whisper. His hand closed slowly into a fist, then opened again. She was sickly from the start, he continued, eyes on the floor. Fever took her one winter. I sat beside her, listening to her breathe, until she didn't anymore. His throat tightened. The next words came rough. My wife followed soon after. Some people die from illness, others from what's left behind. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bow the walls. Amara stood motionless, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. She understood that kind of emptiness, the one that left a person half alive. Her parents, too, had gone in the heat of a summer sickness, leaving her to wander from one hungry season to the next. Slowly, she stepped closer. I know, she said softly. Loss doesn't end. It only changes its weight. Samuel's head lifted. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as the stranger he had rescued, but as someone who might understand the language of absence. She reached out, hesitating, then laid her hand over his. Her palm was warm, trembling slightly. He flinched at the contact, then didn't move away. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt fragile, as if sound itself might break it. Her hand stayed there, small against his scarred one. You carry their memory, she whispered. That means they're still here. He closed his eyes. His breath came slow, deep, uncertain. Then, gently, his fingers turned beneath hers, meeting the touch. Only for a moment. Just enough for warmth to pass between them. Two lives worn thin by the same kind of pain. When he finally withdrew, his face was softer. You'd best go, he murmured. Supper soon. Amara nodded, but before she left, she looked once more at the photo resting in the chest. The woman's smile, the child's small arms. It no longer seemed like a picture of strangers. It looked like the echo of something she had just begun to find again. Connection. As she stepped into the hallway, the door closed behind her with a quiet click. For a long time, Samuel stayed seated, staring at his empty hands. The room smelled of dust and ghosts, but where her touch had rested, his skin still remembered warmth. A reminder that even in houses built from sorrow, something new could still begin to breathe. The air changed before the rain came. By late afternoon, the horizon had folded in on itself, clouds piling like bruises over the plains. The wind shifted from dry to electric, carrying the scent of iron and dust. Every living thing on the ranch felt it. The horses stamping nervously in their stalls, the chickens huddling beneath the porch, even the old dog whining low as if the sky itself had grown teeth. Amara stood by the kitchen window, watching the storm gather. The glass trembled against each gust, the light outside turning the color of tarnished silver. She had never seen a sky so alive and so cruel at once. Samuel had gone out early to secure the herd, refusing to let Elias ride in his place. They know my voice, he had said, pulling on his coat. His figure had vanished into the gray, swallowed by wind and rain. Since then, the house had been too quiet, too large, the ticking clock loud enough to feel like company. By evening, thunder cracked so close it rattled the plates on the shelf. The oil lamp flickered. The fire guttered low. Amara wrapped herself in a blanket and sat near the hearth, listening to the storm hurl itself against the walls. She tried to pray, but the words tangled somewhere behind her ribs. Then came the knock, at first soft, like branches brushing the door. then louder, then pounding. She froze. "Samuel?" she called, rising. The wind answered. Another knock, sharp, insistent, and then a voice, slurred, heavy with liquor. "Open up, girl. I know you're in there." Her breath stopped cold. Billy. Amara backed away from the door, her hands clutching the edge of the blanket. The sound of rain on the roof seemed to close in, sealing her off from the world. "Just a bit of company," he crooned. "Old Henderson's not here to mind." The latch shuddered under his fist. Amara glanced toward the table. A knife lay there, still wet from the potatoes she'd peeled. She reached for it with trembling fingers. The next blow cracked the wood. The hinges screamed. And then he was inside. He staggered across the threshold, drenched and reeking of whiskey, his grin twisted under the lamplight. Now, don't make it harder." Amara stepped back until her spine met the counter. The knife wavered in her hand. Her voice wouldn't rise past a whisper. Billy's boots scraped the floorboards, closing the distance. His shadow fell over hers, wide and swaying. "You're a pretty thing," he muttered. "Too fine to be serving stew for the likes of us." His hand reached out. "Stop." The voice cut through the storm like a rifle crack. Billy froze. Amara turned, and there he was. Samuel stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, rain dripping from his hat brim. His rifle hung in one hand, his eyes burning dark and steady. For a moment, the only sound was the rain roaring behind him. "Get out," he said. Billy stammered. I was just out." The word struck like a hammer. Samuel raised the rifle, not to fire, but to make truth visible. The barrel gleamed under the lamplight, unwavering. Billy's breath hitched. He backed toward the door, muttering curses lost beneath thunder. When he finally stumbled outside, Samuel followed just long enough to bolt the door behind him. The knife slipped from Amara's fingers, clattering against the floor. Her body shook as if the storm had moved inside her. Samuel turned. He leaned the rifle against the wall and stepped closer. His boots left dark prints on the wood. His hand, rough and cold from rain, came to rest on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said. His voice was low, certain. Amara lifted her face. Tears blurred the man before her. The lines, the wear, the fierce stillness. But she saw what mattered. The promise in his eyes. A vow made without ceremony, only truth. She nodded, unable to speak. When he drew her gently into his arms, she let the blanket fall. The scent of rain and sweat and smoke filled her lungs, and something inside her steadied at last. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside, the storm had met its match. That night, in the shelter of his silence and strength, Amara learned the shape of safety. Not in walls, not in locks, but in a single touch that said, "You will not face this alone." The storm passed before dawn, leaving the world hushed and wet. Rain still clung to the eaves, dripping slow, steady, like a heartbeat settling after panic. The ranch stood scarred but unbroken. The fences bowed yet standing. The air washed clean of dust for the first time in months. Inside the house, the hearth still held a faint glow. Amara sat by it, her knees drawn close beneath the wool blanket. The tremor in her hands had not yet faded, though the danger was gone. She could still feel Samuel's hand from the night before, the weight of it on her shoulder, firm, real, anchoring her to the moment when she had nearly been undone. Samuel had gone back out after chasing Billy off. inspecting the damage to the barn through what remained of the rain. When he returned, gray light was already breaking across the plains. His coat hung heavy with water, his boots dragging mud. Without a word, he crossed to the fire, unhooked the rifle, and leaned it aside. For a time, neither spoke. The only sound was the quiet ticking of water dropping from his coat onto the floorboards. Then he went to the cupboard and drew out something wrapped in old linen, a folded cotton dress, its color faded to the soft brown of earth after rain. His voice came low, almost uncertain. "This was my wife's," he said. "It's been here too long without a life in it. Maybe it'll fit you." Amara's throat tightened. She took the dress carefully, her fingers brushing his. For an instant, warmth passed between them. Small, unplanned, but enough to fill the silence. She went to the small room to change. In the mirror's dim light, the fabric fell around her frame, loose but right. It carried the faint smell of cedar, of a woman's life long ended. Yet somehow, when she looked at herself, she didn't feel like an intruder. She felt like someone remembered. When she stepped back into the room, Samuel had seated himself near the fire. He looked up, and for a moment the air between them shifted. He did not speak. His gaze held her, quiet and unflinching, as if afraid to move lest the vision vanish. She stood by the table, uncertain of where to place her hands. "I hope it isn't wrong that I wear it," she said softly. He shook his head once. "It's not wrong." Amara sat across from him. The fire threw soft shadows over the floor, painting their faces in amber and gold. He poured tea into 2 tin cups and slid one toward her. Their fingers brushed again. Accident, or perhaps not. Neither withdrew. The touch lingered. Warmth traveled through her skin, into her chest, where something small and fragile began to open. She lifted her gaze. Samuel met it. For a long time, neither looked away. There were no words for what passed between them. No grand confession. No sudden spark. Only the quiet recognition of 2 lives that had been emptied and were now, against all reason, beginning to fill. Her breath trembled. His hand closed gently around hers, the way a man might handle something already broken, afraid even kindness might harm it further. She did not pull back. When he rose, she followed with her eyes, her pulse echoing in her ears. He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the raindrops still clinging to his hair, the line of exhaustion drawn across his mouth. He reached out, hesitating once, then tilted her chin up with the side of his finger. The gesture was small, reverent. The first kiss was barely that, a question rather than an answer. But it deepened, slow, certain, carrying all that had been lost and all that still might be found. No hunger, no haste. Just 2 people learning that touch could mean solace instead of harm. Later, when the fire burned low, Amara lay against him, her ear resting over the rhythm of his heart. His arm curled around her, protective even in sleep. She listened to that sound until her own breathing matched it. Outside, the plains steamed beneath a newborn sun, the storm's wreckage glinting like silver scars. Inside, something new had taken root, not wild, not sudden, but steady. The beginning of love that would not ask to be named, only lived. Dawn returned as if the world had been forgiven overnight. The storm's ruin shimmered beneath the first light, puddles gleaming like mirrors in the ruts of the yard, wet earth breathing steam, the air carrying that clean, impossible scent that follows after fear. Amara rose before the rooster called. The bed where she had slept was still warm, the blanket heavy with Samuel's scent. Wood smoke, rain, and something quieter she could not name. She folded it carefully, then washed her face in the basin, the water so cold it burned her awake. In the kitchen, she moved with quiet purpose. The hearth still held embers. She coaxed them back to life, feeding them with dry kindling until the small flame caught and grew. She found cornmeal, flour, and a handful of salted pork. Soon the room filled with the smell of frying fat and rising bread, and for the first time since she had arrived, she hummed, a tune her mother once sang on good mornings before the sickness came. The door creaked open behind her. Samuel stood there, boots muddy, hat in hand, as though uncertain he should enter. The light caught him in a way that softened the years in his face. He watched her for a long moment, saying nothing. Perhaps he too was remembering how mornings once felt before grief became habit. She turned, smiling softly. "Breakfast's almost ready." He nodded and stepped inside. His hands brushed the door frame, his gaze flicking from her to the fire to the table already set. He looked like a man trying to memorize the sight. The bell outside rang, the signal for the men. Within minutes, boots struck the porch, voices rose, laughter rolled in like a familiar tide. The ranch hands entered with the smell of sweat and dust, loud until they saw her. A hush fell. There she was, standing at the stove in a plain cotton dress, hair tied back neatly, ladle in hand. The light struck her face and the steam curled around her shoulders like a veil. Jake, the oldest of the crew, cleared his throat. "By heaven," he said, "smells like home again." The men laughed, but it was a quieter kind of laughter this time, almost grateful. Amara set plates before them, her movements careful but steady. The men ate, their talk turning to the work ahead, the fences, the herd. Billy sat at the far end, silent, his head low. When his eyes dared lift toward her, they met Samuel's first. The message there was enough. Billy looked back down and did not speak again. The kitchen filled with warmth, coffee, bread, the murmur of men who had forgotten for a moment how hard the world could be. Samuel sat at the head of the table, his cup cradled in his hands, his gaze never straying far from her. He saw what had changed. The house, the men, even the air itself, everything held a kind of ease that had been gone since his wife and daughter's laughter faded. And all of it somehow began with the woman standing by the stove. When the meal ended and the men left for the fields, the house fell quiet again. Amara stood at the wash basin, sleeves rolled, humming under her breath. Samuel joined her without a word, taking a towel to dry each dish she rinsed. The rhythm between them was unspoken, effortless. At one point, their hands brushed over the same plate. Neither pulled away. They stood close enough for her to hear the even weight of his breath. When she looked up, his eyes were already waiting for hers. For a long moment, no sound but the water dripping into the sink. Then Samuel spoke, voice low, steady. "You've brought life back to this house." Amara smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to the dish in her hand. "It was already here," she said, just waiting for someone to notice. Outside, sunlight spilled across the grass, turning the wet fields into sheets of gold. From the barns came the calls of men and the thrum of new work beginning. The world had found its rhythm again. Inside, two hearts kept their own, quiet, steady, patient. Neither spoke of what had changed between them. They didn't need to. The truth lived already in the silence, the kind that hums when a home has finally begun to breathe again. The afternoon settled warm and bright across the plains, a strange gentleness after so many hard seasons. The earth still smelled of rain, sweet and raw, the puddles in the yard glinting like bits of glass left behind by the storm. From the kitchen window, Amara could see men mending fences, the rhythm of hammers and laughter steady against the wind. Inside, the house felt alive in quiet ways, a kettle humming, curtains lifting in the soft breeze, the creak of boards beneath her bare feet. She moved between sink and table, rinsing dishes from noon, her mind loose and unguarded for once. Then she heard it. Voices. Low at first, drifting from the porch. The sound of matches striking, boots scraping wood, the kind of laughter that carried something sharp beneath it. "Tell me," one said, the older voice dry and amused, "you really think she plans to stay?" Another laugh followed, younger, meaner. "Stay? She's climbing, that's what. From dirt to the main house in a week. Anyone can see how she looks at him." The words hit like a slap she hadn't been braced for. Her hands froze in the water. The dish slipped from her fingers and struck the basin, ringing loud before settling. The laughter outside didn't stop. "Colored girls clever," someone else added. "Always are, when there's something to gain." They laughed again. The sound was light, careless, but it carried all the weight of years she'd spent running from such voices. Amara turned away from the window, her chest tightening until her breath came shallow. The kitchen blurred. Every word they had spoken followed her down the hall like a shadow she couldn't shake. She pushed open the back door and stepped into the yard. The air was clean, but it burned her lungs. She walked past the stables, past the rain barrels, until she reached the small patch of ground behind the house, the overgrown garden that had once belonged to Samuel's wife. The rows were wild now, weeds spilling over the forgotten paths. Yet beneath the tangle she could still see the shape of what had been. The border stones, the faint line where flowers had once stood. She sank down onto the step, buried her face in her hands, and let the tears come. She had been here before, in 100 different ways. In towns that turned their backs, in rooms where silence was safer than truth. No matter how far she walked, judgment found her. For a moment, she thought of leaving, before the whispers grew into something larger, before Samuel himself was made to pay for her presence. But the thought broke something in her. She had found shelter here, and more than that, she had found warmth. Was she to surrender it because others could not bear to see it? The screen door creaked behind her. She looked up through her tears. Samuel was standing a few paces away, hat in hand, eyes shadowed against the sun. He didn't speak at first. His silence was not uncertainty, but understanding. He had heard. "Amara," he said quietly. She turned away, wiping her cheeks with her sleeve. "I just needed some air," she whispered. He stepped closer, boots sinking into the damp soil. For a moment, he only looked at her, his brow furrowed as though weighing what to say. Then, without ceremony, he sat beside her on the wooden step. "I heard them," he said finally. "Men who fear what they don't understand always talk the loudest." Amara swallowed hard. "They think I'm here for your name, or your roof." His hand found hers, rough and sure. Then let them think, I know better. She looked at him through wet lashes. Do you? Samuel turned to face her fully. His grip tightened. I know you came here with nothing and gave this place back its life. That's not climbing, Amara. That's courage. Her lips trembled, but she didn't look away. He went on, his voice lower now, like a vow. You owe no one an explanation. You're not a guest here. You're the reason this house breathes again. Tears spilled anew, but they carried no shame this time. Only release. She leaned into him, and he let her. His arm came around her shoulders, steady, unhurried. They stayed like that as the wind moved gently through the dying weeds. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. Then I'll stay. Samuel nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon. Good. Let them talk. The world's opinion never built a home worth keeping. In the quiet that followed, the air grew lighter. The sun dipped behind the hills, throwing long shadows across the field. Between them, their joined hands rested still, proof that some truths don't need defending. Outside, the whispers might continue, but here, in this small patch of untamed ground, they had found something stronger than rumor. The beginning of peace built not on silence, but on choice. Night found them sitting by the fire, the house quiet except for the faint groan of the rafters and the steady pop of embers. Outside, the wind had gone still, leaving the air so calm it seemed the land itself was holding its breath. Samuel sat in his old armchair, his shoulders bowed but not weary, only thoughtful. Amara sat opposite, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracing the lines of flame that danced along the blackened logs. Between them stretched a hush filled with things neither had yet found words for. He broke it first. Amara, he said, his voice low, rasped by time and hesitation. There's something I've never told a soul. Her gaze lifted. You don't have to. I do, he answered, and the simplicity of it silenced her. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed not on her, but on the fire, as if confession could be safer said to light. My marriage, he began slowly, was not what people believed it to be. The flames flared softly, throwing shadows across his face. They said my wife was gentle, patient. She was in her way. But we were never close. Not truly. We lived beside each other, not with each other. I cared for her, yes, but I never loved her as a man should love a woman. He paused, jaw tightening as though ashamed of the honesty itself. After she passed, after Ruth, everyone pitied me. They called me faithful, devoted, but they didn't know how hollow the house already was before it became empty. Amara said nothing. Her heart beat slow but heavy. She could feel how much it cost him to pull those words into the open. He drew a breath, his gaze still lost in the flickering light. When you came here, I thought you were a burden I could shoulder, a way to distract myself from this silence I built around me. But that isn't what happened. You didn't fill the silence. You changed it. He looked at her then, really looked, and the years between them, the color of their skin, the noise of the world, all of it fell away. I'm not a man good with words, Amara, but when you walk into a room, I remember what breathing feels like. Her throat ached with unshed tears. She stood, almost without meaning to, and crossed the space between them. Kneeling beside his chair, she took his hand, the same one that had once trembled over a photograph of the dead and laid her palm over it. His skin was rough, scarred from years of work, a single pale line running across his knuckles like an old road map. She traced it gently with her thumb. "This," she whispered, "you carry so much here. The land, the loss, the man you've been, but you've never let it define you." Samuel's breath shuddered. "And you?" he asked softly. "What have you carried?" Her hand tightened. "The feeling of being unseen," she said, "of always standing at the edge of someone else's life, of having to prove I belonged anywhere at all." For a moment, neither moved. The air between them was heavy with the truth of it. Two souls bent by different storms, each recognizing the same ache in the other. He lifted his free hand and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was hesitant, reverent, as though he feared even tenderness might undo her. "Amara," he murmured, her name rough in his throat. "I can't promise peace, not in a land like this, but I can promise a place, here, beside me." She looked up, her dark eyes glimmering. "I don't need promises," she said. "Only honesty." He gave a faint, broken smile. "Then that's what I'll give you." They stayed that way, her hand resting against his, the firelight softening the edges of the world. No vow passed their lips, yet something deeper settled between them, a shared knowing that neither of them would walk alone again. Outside, the moon climbed high, casting pale light through the window. It touched the scar on his hand, the tear on her cheek, and the quiet space where their fingers met. What had once been a wound, his, hers, both, no longer felt like a mark of loss. It had become the place where healing began. Rumor traveled the way wind does, quiet at first, then everywhere. It began as whispers in the saloon, grew into laughter at the general store, and soon took root even in the church pews. People called it shameful, foolish, unnatural. "Old Henderson," they said, "gone soft over a colored girl." The words carried dust and venom in equal measure. Samuel heard them secondhand from Elias. Amara didn't need to. She could feel them. Every trip to the well, every walk into town for flour or coffee, the silence of others followed her like a shadow. Women looked away. Men stared too long. Children whispered, repeating what they'd heard at their mothers' tables. At first, she tried to ignore it, but cruelty, even soft-spoken, wears a body down. Each night she sat by the window while Samuel read in his chair. Her thoughts tangled in questions she didn't dare speak aloud. Would he tire of it? Of defending her? Of the cost that came with loving her? One morning, he saddled the wagon. "I'm heading into town for supplies," he said. "Come with me." Amara hesitated. "Together?" He met her gaze, calm but firm. "Yes, together." The road was dry again, the ruts carved deep by weeks of hauling grain. They sat side by side, the air filled with the creak of wood and the steady rhythm of hooves. Samuel drove, his hands loose on the reins, his expression unreadable. Amara's fingers twisted in her lap. She had never feared distance, but the nearness of people, of judgment, felt heavier than any desert she'd crossed. By the time they reached town, the square was alive with market day. Stalls lined the street, women selling eggs, men loading sacks of corn, a wagon of children chasing one another through the dust. But as Samuel helped her down, the motion of the crowd slowed. Heads turned, It was not the first time the town had stared at her, but this time Samuel didn't release her hand. "Lift your chin," he murmured. "They've seen ghosts before. Let them see the living for once." She breathed deep and did as he said. They walked together through the marketplace. The sound of their steps, the syncopated rhythm of boots and shoes, seemed to echo against every wooden wall. A few men nodded stiffly at Samuel. Others looked away. Two women at the cloth stall whispered behind their gloves, the sound sharp and deliberate. Samuel ignored them all. He spoke to the vendors in his steady, even voice. Ordered flour, seed corn, lamp oil. Never once did he drop her hand. When they reached the blacksmith's, a man leaning against the post spat into the dirt. "Didn't think your kind mixed that way, Henderson," he said, grinning. "Guess drought makes a man thirsty for anything." Laughter rippled nearby. Samuel turned slowly, meeting the man's eyes. "You must be mistaking thirst for courage," he said. His tone was level, but his gaze did not waver. "One I've got. The other you wouldn't recognize." "Box," laughter died. He turned back to Amara. "Come," he said softly. They finished their errands in silence. When they climbed back into the wagon, she could no longer hold the tears stinging behind her eyes. "Why don't you care what they say?" she asked quietly. Samuel flicked the reins, eyes on the horizon. "Because none of them have ever lived a life worth envying." He paused, voice gentler. "And because I know what I want. That's all." She watched him, the way his jaw set firm, the way the light caught in his silvered hair. Something inside her shifted, an ache that felt like pride. When they reached the ranch, the men were still in the fields. The yard smelled of dust and grass, the sky blushed with early dusk. Samuel helped her down again, but this time she didn't let go of his hand. Inside the house, she moved to the window, watching the fading horizon. "They'll keep talking," she said. "They will," he replied. "Let them. The land doesn't listen, and neither should we." Amara turned, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "I never thought I'd be worth standing up for." Samuel crossed to her, placed a hand over her heart. "Then let me prove it every day." The room fell silent except for the wind sighing through the cracks. Outside, the town's judgment still lingered somewhere beyond the fields. But here, within these worn wooden walls, their defiance felt like peace. The world could talk itself hoarse. Love had already answered. Evening came soft and golden, the kind that seems to forgive everything the day got wrong. The light slipped through the kitchen window, painting warm stripes across the floorboards and the curve of Amara's arm as she worked. The smell of bread rising filled the air. Yeast and smoke and home. She stood at the table, kneading dough in slow, steady rhythm. Her hands pressed, folded, turned, movements learned from years of survival and small hopes. Flour streaked her forearms, dusted her cheek. The old cotton dress clung faintly to her waist, swaying with each motion. Samuel watched from the doorway. He had just returned from the fields, his boots still carrying dust from the far fences. For a long moment, he didn't move. There was something about the way she stood there, barefoot in the fading light, that made him feel the ache of all he had lost, and the quiet wonder of what he had somehow been given again. Amara didn't notice him at first. She hummed softly, an old tune without words. It drifted through the air, mingling with the fire's crackle. When she finally looked up and saw him, her lips curved into a small smile. "You're back," she said. "Bread will be ready soon." He didn't answer right away. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click. His eyes lingered on her, on the small flower prints her fingers had left on the table, on the glow that the fire had laid across her skin. He had known that house in every form, silent, broken, empty. But never like this. Never so alive. He took a slow breath. His voice, when it came, carried a rough edge of decision. Amara. She stilled, hands buried in the dough. Yes? He hesitated, as if the words themselves had waited years to be said. Then he crossed the room and stopped before her. I have no ring, he began quietly, and I have no fine speech left in me. All I have are these hands, and the land they've built. He lifted them slightly, rough palms open. If you'll have me, they'll be yours, for as long as they can hold anything. For a moment, she didn't breathe. The air seemed to pause with her. Samuel, she whispered, the sound barely more than breath. He went down on one knee, not with grace, but with the awkward gravitas of a man unused to asking. His eyes stayed on hers, clear and earnest in the firelight. I thought I'd finished with life, he said. Then you came and the house began to breathe again. I've been alone so long I forgot what warmth felt like. Don't let it fade again. The words fell between them like something living. Amara's throat tightened. She stared at the man before her, the gray in his hair, the scars on his hands, the way his shoulders had carried both loss and hope without complaint. Her heart swelled until she could hardly stand it. She reached out, her flower-covered fingers trembling, and placed her hand in his. White powder clung to his dark skin, softening it, binding them in something both clumsy and holy. Tears blurred her sight. Yes, she said, voice breaking. Yes, Samuel, I need nothing but this. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead to the back of her hand. His breath shuddered as if a lifetime's weight had finally lifted. Thank you, he murmured, for choosing me. Amara laughed softly through her tears. You talk as if I had a choice. He looked up at her then, and the small smile that found his mouth was the first she had seen without sorrow in it. He rose, pulling her gently into his arms. She felt his heartbeat through the thin cotton between them, slow, sure, unafraid. They stayed that way, the kitchen filled with the hum of the fire and the scent of bread baking in the oven. The day folded quietly into night, and nothing in the world felt missing anymore. When the bread was done, they broke it together, steam rising like prayer. The crust burned her fingers, and Samuel laughed, a sound rough and warm that filled every corner of the house. Outside, the horizon sank into amber. Inside, beneath the humblest roof, two people who had once been strangers shared the simplest of vows. No promises of forever, no grand ceremony, only truth and the steady courage to live it. And as the light dimmed, the old ranch house, the one that had held too much silence, finally felt full. The wedding came quietly, like rain after a long drought, without announcement, without ceremony, but with a peace that settled into the bones. There were no carriages, no fine gowns, no crowd to bear witness. Only the people who had lived beside them through storms and seasons, the ranch hands, their wives, a handful of neighbors, and the land itself watching in its silent way. It was late summer. The fields, once cracked and bare, shimmered faintly with the promise of green. The air smelled of dust and rain, of things returning to life. Samuel stood on the porch, his white shirt freshly washed, but frayed at the collar. His fingers fumbled with a tie that refused to sit right. Elias, standing nearby, gave a half smile. "You've tamed worse than this," he muttered. Samuel chuckled, the sound rough but light. Inside, laughter drifted through the open window. The wives of ranch hands had gathered around Amara, fastening a small crown of wildflowers into her curls. Her dress was plain, cotton and faded blue, but the light that touched her made it seem like silk. One of the women whispered, "No woman ever looked finer for it being simple." Amara smiled, though her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric over her hips. Her reflection in the small, cracked mirror startled her, not because she looked different, but because for the first time, she looked like someone who belonged somewhere. Outside, the clouds were gathering, low, gray, and full. The air trembled with the faint scent of rain. When she stepped through the doorway, the ranch fell silent. Samuel turned. For a heartbeat, he forgot how to breathe. She walked toward him slowly, her eyes fixed on his, the hem of her dress brushing the weathered planks. The foreman cleared his throat and began the words that bound them. His voice was steady, the wind carrying it beyond the porch. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, in want and in plenty. As the vows fell between them, the first drop of rain broke against the dust, then another. The earth, parched and waiting, began to drink. When Elias finished, he looked up, eyes soft with something like pride. "That's done," he said simply. Samuel bent his head and kissed her. It wasn't a grand kiss. It was quiet, reverent, the kind that said, "We made it here." Around them, rain began to fall in earnest, soaking hair, skin, and cloth alike. No one moved to run for cover. Laughter rose instead, the kind that feels like release. Someone called it a blessing. And in truth, it was. Inside the house, they gathered again. The same walls that had once known nothing but silence now alive with voices. The long table was draped in a worn white cloth, holding plates of bread, beans, and smoked meat. The fire burned bright. A fiddle played somewhere, and the floor creaked under the rhythm of boots tapping in time. Amara stood at the center, watching them all. For the first time, she didn't stand apart. This was her home now. The laughter, the warmth, the smell of rain still clinging to the windowsills. Samuel came up behind her, his arm sliding around her shoulders. He didn't speak, just looked at her and nodded once as if to say, "We built this." Later, when the guests had gone and the house grew quiet again, they sat side by the window. Outside, the rain still whispered over the land. Samuel took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles over her skin. "I thought my life had ended with grief," he said softly. "But you came and proved there's more to live for than surviving." Amara leaned her head against his shoulder, smiling faintly. "I thought I would always be the shadow in someone else's story. But today I stood in the light." They sat that way until the fire burned low, until the rain became a steady murmur. Outside, the earth drank deeply. Inside, two hearts, once hollowed by loss, beat in quiet harmony. On that land of dust and wind, where summers burned and winters froze, they had found something enduring. Not perfection, not glory, but a life built by hand and heart. And when morning came, sunlight rose over the wet fields, turning every blade of grass to gold. The house, the land, and the love between them, each shone with the same truth: that even after the hardest years, life can still begin again. Do you still remember the first hand that held yours on a quiet afternoon? Share that memory with us in the comments below. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so we can keep preserving the most beautiful fragments of love, the kind that still blooms, even on the driest ground.